And we're live. Hi, everybody. I'm Beth Holland. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm super excited to be here with Bill Fitzgerald. I know that Bill and I have had a lot of conversations over the last few years, and he's always my go-to when I have any questions. Oops, hang on. I had the other one going. We are definitely live. So super excited to have him here to talk about like all of the things that make us crazy as educators when we're trying to figure out like how do we empower our students to be able to share their work and publish and connect with different audiences, but at the same time we want to make sure that we're keeping them safe and we're protecting their privacy and we're teaching them like really good lessons for taking forward. And you know, since book creators got their new publishing platform coming out and their new Chrome app is on the way, you know, this was just such a great opportunity for us to have a chance to bring Bill in and to have him, you know, help us really understand both, you know, the power of what we can do, but also how we can be really smart educators to help support our students. So, Bill, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and we can get going. So take it away.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you so much for having me on here. It's great to be able to kind of talk with you and also to be able to talk privacy. Yeah, I am the director of the Privacy Evaluation Initiative at Common Sense Media. And my job there is I am part of a team that evaluates the privacy policies in terms of service of commonly used EdTech apps. And we do this as part of a consortium of about between 120 and 130 school districts throughout the US. And we work closely with school districts, teachers, vendors, and parents to kind of make sure that we are, you know, A, asking the right questions, and B, helping people make more informed decisions easier about what kind of is appropriate pedagogically and what's appropriate from a privacy and security place. We like to stress that there is no absolute right answer. Everybody needs to decide this for themselves. But understanding more about the context and the goals that you're trying to achieve with any piece of technology can help you make a more informed decision.
Thanks. I mean, I know that it's something where, you know, and I think about getting started using, you know, technology with my students and being so excited when things finally started to go web-based, and also realizing how completely uninformed I was and the number of mistakes I made as a teacher. You know I keep getting more and more conscious of it. And so, I mean, just to start, I think sometimes the idea of, you know, why teachers and parents should be so concerned. And, you know, I know that, you know, Bill, you actually did a session a little over a year ago with like NAIS and the Berkman Institute, and a bunch of others. And I remember asking Justin Reich, who's one of the directors over at EdTech Teacher and also is a Berkman Fellow. And I said, you know, Justin, why do we care so much? Because you think like, oh, well, it's my kid's book report that we're putting online and we want to share it with grandma and grandpa. So like, why am I really that concerned? And he made a comment to me that was just totally eye-opening, where he said, you know, we have to make sure we're talking about privacy and data with our students because we don't want a generation that's complicit in thinking that they have no right to privacy. And the second he made that comment, I know I totally shifted my entire approach to how I considered it, where it was like, what are those ramifications and what are the things that as adults we really need to think about so that we're being really good role models and we're being really instructive to help students understand this. And so, you know, I'm curious about what your take is, like how are we starting to introduce this and why should we really be paying attention to it?
Well, yeah, I mean, and you bring up a few really important points that kind of all need actually additional focus because they're kind of central to what the issues are. Like people often will try and distill it down to like, well, what is the problem if this one thing gets exposed? And that is in some ways a highly disingenuous argument because data, an individual data point is just that. It's one small piece of information, but data doesn't exist in isolation. It actually exists as part of larger systems. And most data points are can be parts of multiple systems. Mm-hmm. And it's when these individual data points get collected and recombined and analyzed against multiple different backdrops that we start to actually see the power of data. Like that's, you know, we don't spend a lot of time talking about, you know, the value of individual data point X, but we do spend a lot of time talking about big data. And the reason is, like, again, these small individual data points, they start to add up. I mean, in two stories that actually just like both kind of came live within the last like 48 to 96 hours. One is the data breach or the data leak from the Republicans, the Republican National Committee, where they exposed data on 198 million Americans. A lot of this is stuff that's actually publicly available, stuff that, you know, basically you can buy via the voter rolls. But a lot of it's actually stuff that has been recombined from multiple sources, including things like social media profiles, the Facebook quizzes you take, your likes and stuff like that. Your likes on Facebook, individual data points, pretty boring. If you combine upwards of 40 of those, you can actually apply predictive analytics and make highly accurate predictions about a range of fairly personal traits, including like which direction you're going to vote, whether somebody is gay or straight can be predicted on the basis of likes. And you can actually start to get as accurate as your friends with as few as like 40 likes. So this is where like you have individual data points, they begin to add up. And the point about normalizing surveillance is really where it starts to take on, I think it's most, both one of the more significant and one of the more misunderstood pieces here. Like right now, like we have a generation who thinks it's normal to carry a computer in your pocket and to call people using that computer. Like if you are 10 years old, you've really never known a world where that isn't the norm if you live in the US. However, we are also actually normalizing taking a piece of, I mean, we essentially all have our own trackers too, because that same computer that we carry in our pocket is also something that can actually place us in a pretty specific location based on, at the very least, how that phone, you know, communicates with cell towers around us. So on the one hand, we've gotten people used to carrying a phone around, but we've also gotten people used to having their location tracked. I think we're too early in to really understand what that means, but at the very least, we need to acknowledge that's a shift.
Yeah, it was funny. I got my phone all of a sudden started telling me how long it was going to take me to get places. And I'm not sure what was turned on, and it just started freaking me out. I'm like, how did you know that I wanted to go to the gym right now? And it's like, it was just because I don't know what had happened. I turned something off and it quit doing it, but it was really freaking me out where it's like, how did you know? Because I know what I had in my calendar, but it didn't say that's where I was going. Or you get in the car and it would say, oh, it'll take you an hour and a half to get home. And it's like, well, how'd you know I was going home?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's those things out there. Amazon thinks I'm completely bizarre. I love its recommendations. I have lots of nieces and nephews and godchildren, but I'm also working on my doctorate. So it's like, would you like Snuffle Bunny or mixed methods research methods? You know? Either one we'll send you. We think you might like it based on your past purchases. And sneakers. You know? Yeah.
Well, and pretty soon Amazon will be able to add food recommendations into the mix there.
There we go. I'll get groceries, sneakers, and research method.
But and obviously that's a reference to their purchase of Whole Foods.
No, I was with you. I knew that. But I mean, I think too, as we, you know, bringing back to our students and the things that we're bringing into it, you know, we probably don't want, as much as we want them to be able, again, to publish and share and, you know, connect with students from all over the world, we also want to make sure that they're not just becoming, you know, a commodity of a data point at such a young age.
I mean, but this is also where, I mean, I think having candid conversations with kids about what it means to work online, and really, I mean, and I think as soon as you're, I mean, and I think, you know, the time to start talking with kids about this is actually as they start interacting online. So like, if you think a kid is old enough to start doing this thing online, like again, I mean, you can actually mix in questions like, you know, what do you think happens when you hit the screen? What do you think happens when you click the mouse? Where does that go? I mean, because that's basic information literacy, and that's part of what it means to actually interact online in our world today. Like there are a huge host of actually really valuable opportunities, but we need to understand what comes with those opportunities.
I remember actually sitting with a group of second graders, and we were just using, like, we had an Apple lab, and so they were just learning, like, how do you log onto the computer, and we traced all the wires to where it went, and so it wasn't on the internet, but it was still, you know, they all knew each other's username and passwords because I had everything set up with like first name, last initial. But I remember trying to talk to them like, what does privacy mean with second graders? And it was in the fall. And there was one little kid who says, it's like when you go to the bathroom and no one else should go with you. And I'm like, that's exactly what it is. And every time I come, you know, sometimes privacy can get so convoluted. And I think about this little 7-year-old who just says, when you go to the bathroom, you should go by yourself. And I'm like, exactly. You don't need to share that with everybody else. So just, but even at I just keep thinking about those super young ages, like we can bring it down to that level.
Well, and those are the questions that are central to actually grounding this in a student's lived experience. Like actually having kids describe what do they think privacy means? Like what do they think security means? Mm-hmm. You know, how do they, I mean, on a kid's definition of safety and an adult's definition of safety, like those are going to be different definitions, and there's some really interesting ground. I mean, and honestly, if we wanted to go full meta on this, like if the first piece of writing they did in an app like Book Creator was to describe what safety, privacy, and security were, like, okay, like, and then the second one could be like, okay, well, how do they play out in this app? You can actually have the writing embedded in the curriculum, the citizenship piece embedded in the curriculum, and then the higher level thought. Like this, you know, how do you actually define something like privacy? Because we're all going to have different definitions of it, but by allowing students to interact with that in their words, in their terms, in their world, I think like adults can definitely learn something from that, and also figure out what we need to augment. I also think an additional piece of this is there are a lot of adults who don't understand this fully as well, and adults in particular, I think, are more prone to be in the I have nothing to hide camp. And I think it's great that there are adults who want to put their head in the sand and pretend everything is fine, but they're not doing a service to kids. So I think adults actually could learn from kids in some of these cases, because there are times when kids have an instinctive understanding of the way these intrusions happen that adults are not set up to get.
And I think being able to model, like the more we can talk about things, and I remember modeling with my 6th graders where I was teaching them about copyright and Creative Commons, and like what can we use and share online and what do we not use, and having all of these conversations back and forth and getting to where we would start a new project, and I'd say to them from the beginning, once they had an understanding, how do we want to share this? Like, do we want to just keep it inside the walls of the classroom, or do we want to bring this to a broader audience? And depending on what their decision was, we would, you know, shift accordingly and say, okay, well, if we do want to share this, what are all the things we have to think about? And just to have those conversations over and over again, because otherwise, I think it was Lawrence Lessig, who's the constitutional law professor, and he made a comment, and this was like 2005 or 2006, that we were raising a generation of pirates. He's like, and they just think you can take everything and put everything, and they're not really thinking about any of it, and it's just this constant invasion. And so I remember thinking, okay, well, how do I start to model this and say, here are the things that we need to think about before we just jump?
Well, and kind of two thoughts. I mean, the generation of pirates thing, I mean, that also reflects a lot of the tech, that reflects some tech industry attitudes towards personal information as well. There are a lot of apps that are set up to take and do it in a pretty opaque way. Like most of our commercial social media services are like that. So, you know, like I'd be curious kind of what that lens looks like if we turn it on the tools that we use to actually interact with each other. But the related thing to that, like I love the connections between openly licensed content, student agency, like learner agency, authorial voice, and privacy. Because I actually think there's some significant overlaps and some really important ways that the decision to use an open license and learner agency and privacy interact. Like these are all, I think, part of the same some of the same kind of basic issues that relate to how we project our voice into the world and how we acknowledge and attribute our sources. Like, one of the things I love about the OER space is that it really is, it's some of its most basic levels, it's just good scholarship. The different forms of attribution that are tied to different licenses, it's just what you do in in an academic world, and really in a social world too. Like, it's not cool to steal somebody else's idea, but at the same time, the idea of like, what do you share and what do you hold back? Key elements of privacy, key elements in thinking about privacy.
I mean, honestly, like as a scholar right now and as a doctoral student, I'm having this every time I go to write something right now, I'm having this debate. Like, okay, what's my dissertation work? What do I want to share now? Like, what do I share now? And what am I holding on to for later? Yep. And that's, how do we start to teach them to think about, that aspect, especially as they start to get older? I think, high school, as they start to move into college, when do you share and when do you hold on to something?
Yeah. Well, and also as a doctoral student, what are your thoughts on the fact that your work is going to be collected up into anti-plagiarism software, where they have a business model that relies on your labor?
Well, and as a student, I wasn't given a choice on that. So every paper, I don't know if I signed anything, I didn't sign anything, but I know that every paper I submit's been sucked into some, I mean, we can go down a whole different road with anti-plagiarism. I've had, working as a TA, apparently us TAs are actually more accurate than the plagiarism software sometimes. Like that human element. I read a lot of papers that I had to flag that the software didn't pick up this fall, where I was like, this doesn't sound right. But at the same time, I have no idea, because they're going to take that. My dissertation is going to get dumped into a library database. If I want that to be done, it has to go there. But at the same time, there's also the point where, at least when it goes in, it's attached to my identity, and that means that no one else can take it. So I think there's a double-edged sword on that. Like, I know that's going to be published. I know where it's going to go. But I also know that means that no one else will be able to take it once it gets there. So I guess I know we kind of got into like some big picture ideas, but to come back a little bit to more of like the nuts and bolts sort of things, like if, when teachers start thinking about, wow, there's all these great tools out there and there's all these great things for my students to use, but like, what are some like things that they should be looking for? I mean, we've talked about different acronyms, like, you've got FERPA and COPPA, and then there's different certifications, but when it comes down to it, like, what should a teacher really be paying attention to before they try and get their students signed up and using something?
So I'm going to give some specific advice for teachers in schools, which is different advice that I would give for district staff. It's different than the advice I would give for district staff, different than the advice I would give for parents, and different than the advice I would give for a student. So this is teacher specific. The first thing I would recommend they do, or like the first thing I would recommend they do is actually take a look, read the description of the software, and see if it's even remotely in the ballpark with aligning with the pedagogical goals of what they're trying to achieve. It doesn't matter where, before you do anything, this is, before a download, before creating an account, just like read the description of it and see if it sounds like it'll actually do anything remotely useful. Before a teacher downloads it, they should actually look at go to the terms of service and the privacy policy and do focus searches using your browser. Usually Control F will do it. And look for some key things to look for. Search for the term consent or parental consent. Because those are what a lot of apps will sometimes do, is they will put all of the obligation for getting parental consent on the teacher. This is especially true if an app is being used with under 13s. This also has some implications on FERPA, where parental consent can allow a vendor to do more things with data than FERPA would ordinarily allow. But if the app says that the teacher is responsible for getting all parental consents, that should be a flag that triggers more review, because at that point the teacher is actually legally liable. And in some cases, the teacher is actually creating a binding legal agreement between their district and the vendor, which in a lot of public schools, teachers don't actually have the right to do. That actually varies district by district. So thing one, look for consent. The best option there is the vendor manages parental consent for under 13s themselves. The second best option is the teacher is expected to maintain it on their own. That is more work for the teacher, but the teacher at least knows that it's happening. In some cases, I've actually seen a small number of vendors actually create a record-keeping requirement where the teacher is required to get parental consent, and the terms actually say that the teacher should show that paperwork to the vendor if the vendor asks it. That should be a flag not to use the app. That's an unfair, really an unfair, and it's really kind of unclear what would happen with that request in a court of law if it happened, but that's a legal gray area that exposes a teacher to risk. So first thing to look for is consent. Second thing to look for is search for third party. Also search for affiliates, also search for partners. And the reason you look for those are three common terms that will describe if any other organizations can get information. If you see no hits from any of those, that should be a flag that the vendor probably isn't describing all of their business relationships as clearly as they should. And you should do more research before using the app. If you look at a third party and you see that the third party can actually sell data, or you don't see any restrictions on use, also a good sign not to use it, because that means you're setting up potential privacy issues. Third thing to look for is updates. And again, in the search terms here would be do a search for change, do a search for update, do a search for modify. And what you're looking for here is what notification you'll be given if a vendor changes their terms. Mm-hmm. The best case scenario is users are notified via email. The worst case scenario is people are notified and the vendor says to check the page frequently. If it's the worst case scenario, that's a good reason not to use the app, because a vendor can then change the terms under you and you have no legal recourse. You're at that point exposed. Though, I mean, there's a whole host of other things. Like, I mean, I literally, I spend my day reading privacy policies. And we, on the Common Sense site, we have a list of the 100 or so questions we ask when we're evaluating apps. But those are the big ones. Something else to check for as a flag is just make sure that the vendor has an updated on date. If you're in California and they don't have that, that violates a law named CalOPPA. But that's also it's a good flag if a vendor doesn't have the updated date on their terms. It's a sign that it's a potential sign that they are not paying attention to other details as well, and there are going to be issues. Like, it doesn't create many problems in and of itself, but it's a good flag that there are going to be other problems that exist. But yeah, I mean, those are the kind of 3 to 4 things I would look for quickly. One other thing to look for is actually just make sure they actually have a set of policies. You wouldn't be surprised, but a lot of people would be surprised how many apps don't have privacy policies at all. And if a vendor doesn't have privacy policies, like, don't use the app.
So if a teacher looks though and says, it says, oh, it's COPPA compliant, or oh, the other one is that student privacy pledge. Like, if it says that, can a teacher say, oh, then this must be okay with my kids? Or should they still ask more critical questions?
Always ask more critical questions. Like there was a while back, there was and this was covered in the New York Times, like probably three years ago, maybe. There was a vendor that was a pledge signatory that wasn't encrypting information on it had some pretty serious and pretty basic security issues that affected how there were a complete lack of protection of student data, and this was a pledge signatory. I think it's a good thing when you see that if somebody is publicly stating that they're doing, they're doing X, like, yeah, it's interesting, but it doesn't, there's no get out of jail free card. Like there's nothing that should really take the place of a teacher inspecting an app that they're using. Like at the end of the day, if one person is making a decision about where the personal information of, anywhere between 20 to 200 other people are going, they have an obligation to do some due diligence. They should not take anybody's word for it. They should actually inspect it themselves. And if they feel that they're too busy to do it, they should, again, I mean, we have an obligation to do our homework.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I just think about, I know once I started thinking more critically about it, I was sort of joking and sort of not, but sometimes before even reading the about page, I've been looking at the terms and the privacy part of, what's the information, what's not, and some things that, I've started feeling a lot better about when I'm recommending different tools is like, who gets to control what goes public? And
yes.
I found myself talking about like I called it the oopsie factor. Like, I love it when the teacher has control and like nothing gets published until the teacher says, yep, that's good to go. Because then if a student makes a mistake, like our school had a policy of no first and last names. Yeah. And so if a student made a mistake and they actually wrote a first and last name, you have an oopsie and you can say, hey, that's not the way we do it. Let's take that out. Or whatever it is, it's not just public until the teachers put that last set of eyes on it. To be able to say that. And then I'm a big fan too of looking to see if the published site is indexed or not. Yep. Like, is it a hidden link? Is it not a hidden link? So things like, I know Padlet gives you a choice. Do you want a hidden link or do you actually want to make this public? Just as an example, book creators published links are all hidden links. So that's something too, where it's like, do I want someone to find this or just want, the kids to be able to share it with mom and dad and aunts and uncles and whoever it might be?
Well, I mean, that's also one of the things too, like there are a lot of apps that will support social sharing, and from a privacy place, like that's a flag, because whenever you see the social sharing icons, those in and of themselves leak data, but then there's a whole range of other information and data collection systems that get triggered as soon as something is shared socially. And when I say shared socially, I mean on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Pinterest, the usual suspects. So on the one hand, like from the place of the vendor getting free publicity, it really works for them. From the place of protecting student information and being proactive about respecting loaner agency, it really doesn't. But yeah, you mentioned actually evaluating applications. Like my process, whenever I hear of a new app, first thing I do is I go to the login screen and I look for encryption. I'll go and I'll if the page shows up encrypted, I'll remove the S and try and reload it, see what happens. If it loads unencrypted, that's a non-starter. I'll go to the account creation page and do the same thing. I'll also look for links to the terms of service and the privacy policy from that page. If those are missing on the account creation page, that's a non-starter. And then I'll go and look at the terms and do some of the searches. The one other search from a FERPA compliance place is if you think that an application is going to be collecting information that you would be giving a grade on in a class, you want to take a look at what the vendor says about a parent's right to review it. So another good search for an educational site is actually just search for parent or parental. I like parent because that will pull up parental as well, and just see what rights a vendor gives to parents. It's not applicable in higher ed, but for students aged 13 to 18 who are out of COPPA but still in K-12, the parental right to review that's something that is covered under a lot of use cases with FERPA.
So just to clarify that, so say I use, creation tool X, whatever it is, and the student creates this project. If I, as the teacher, then grade that project, even though the grade's not, like maybe that's in a separate grade book, there's still a FERPA issue? Am I understanding that?
So a lot of this will depend on how districts define education records. I mean, in one of the, if you want to get a lot of blank stares, ask people how their district defines an education record. This is not information that's like, people are not told what they need to know about this. Because, you know, FERPA covers education records. And generally an education record is something that's maintained by the school or its agent about a student. And that's a broad definition. I mean, and I'm sure like if there are any lawyers that have actually made it this far, they will all simultaneously cringe for different reasons at my definition, because that's a layperson's definition, not the legal definition. Like the legal definition, you should refer to statute for it. But I mean, teachers should actually go to their district staff and say, hey, how are we defining an education record? Can you explain what is and what isn't an education record? And districts should be able to actually give that guidance to their staff, because otherwise, like I mean, the good news is there have been actually 0 FERPA sanctions in the entire time that FERPA, like 0 financial sanctions for the entire time FERPA's been in existence. But the bad news is, like, a FERPA sanction means you lose federal funding. So districts, I think, have an obligation to give that training to their teachers, and teachers, I think, have an obligation to ask for it from their districts.
I had not thought about that part. I mean, I've worked with some districts where anything that was identifiable could not go into a tool without parental consent. And I remember we were going through like all kinds of things of, you know, at what point does something become, you know, is it voice? Is it a picture? Is it a name? Where does that go?
Well, and FERPA is actually, you know, provides actually some guidance there, but this is where, you know, in some districts, these things can be declared directory information, which means they can be shared without consent. So, I mean, there's multiple layers of that, but, you know, I mean, the most privacy protective stance for district to take is to define directory information very conservatively, and then get parental consent for other pieces of information, and be conservative with how those are collected and shared. But yeah, but it is literally different in every single district across the country, because every district can define this differently.
So can I get you to back up 1 second and clarify one other point?
Yeah, totally.
Sorry. I mean, what we've been talking about, like, so I know FERPA has to do with, you know, understanding how the records keeping is going for all students K-12. And so like, that's under like that Family Education Records Act. And that one I know because I sat through a 3-day institute on it when I was teaching. But COPPA only turns on for under 13. Where's the nuance on that one? Or what does that give you that FERPA doesn't?
So like FERPA is like the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And that is, and part of FERPA is also PPRA, the RA is Rights Amendment. One of the P's is pupil. I forget what the full PPRA stands for, but that PPRA covers survey data. And there are like 7 different elements that are covered under PPRA. But if you're putting up a survey that asks about religious interests or political interests, like you're running into PPRA, and you should review what you're asking and how you're using it, and if you actually need it. FERPA is education specific and just refers to, you know, FERPA governs like an education record, and a subset of information in FERPA is called directory information. And traditionally directory information, and also FERPA dates, I think it was passed in 1974, and it really was designed to address paper records. So things like under FERPA, directory information can be, you know, your first name, last name, your date of birth, place of birth, your phone number, your email address, which was added, you know, when internet came in, your home address. So, I mean, directory information that under FERPA can be shared without consent, that definition still includes some pretty sensitive information. But things that are a gray area under FERPA are things like metadata collected by a learning application. So like, is it, you know, it's unclear if the amount of time somebody spends completing a quiz, is that part of an education record, or is that not covered under FERPA? So the education record definition is what makes FERPA what it is. COPPA is more, I mean, COPPA is a consumer statute that obviously applies to elementary education because we have kids under the age of 13 in our public schools and in our private schools. And it's really designed to make sure that parents are given the right to consent to some collection and use of their kids' information to support an application. There's a carve out in COPPA that lets schools give parental consent for parents if an application is only going to be used for an educational purpose. A lot of vendors run into problems with that if they have third-party ad tracking on their site, because the application is a, so again, it's a gray area. But so yeah, I mean, that's a high level overview between the two. I mean, we could spend a long time talking about the differences between COPPA and FERPA. And then people would still kind of, I think, disagree with some of our interpretations. This is also where, like, I love listening to lawyers talk about this, and I'm not a lawyer. But yeah, there are lawyers who have actually specialized in this, and I love hearing them talk about it because I always learn corners that I've never thought of before.
And so with COPPA protecting kids under 13, and I know that maybe it's just to get around knowing that there's this extra legislation where the terms of service so often are 13 plus,
yeah.
Where, with elementary school kids, and even to middle school, that creates challenges because you want kids to be able to use things. And then you see this like, oh, well, it's 13 plus.
Yeah.
And I'll admit it, I did a no-no when I was teaching, and like I had a teacher account that the kids would log into, but I know from talking to you, that's a no-no.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I mean, from a modeling place, like, again, modeling good digital citizenship for kids, like that's not the direction that we want to go. I mean, if you see an app that actually says in their terms, this is not for use by people under the age of 13, again, I mean, if a vendor says something, we have an obligation to take them at their word. And if you want to use it with under 13s, then kind of your best bet is to actually contact the vendor and say, hey, I really want to use your app. Here's how it could be done. These are the changes you need to make. One of the things in COPPA is if a vendor has actual knowledge that an application is being used by people under the age of 13. And there are a few different ways legally that actual knowledge can be established. Some of those include like the activities within the app and the graphics that are used. Like if they're, in the same way that, Joe Camel was clearly designed to apply to kids. Some of the same things can be, some of the same standards hold for the online space. So if there's a case to be made that a vendor has actual knowledge that their app is being used by kids, even though they try and say like, oh, well, we don't know, like they know, and the obligations of COPPA kick in. This is where there are some places where some of the least convincing language in the world is when a vendor says, I'm COPPA compliant because we comply with COPPA. And I mean, and you see that in terms, like you see this, like, this circular logic. And to me, that's always a flag. But, if I see graphics on a homepage that are, cartoon derived, and then I see terms that say like, we have no actual knowledge about the age of our users. It's like, well, like at that point that triggers a deeper look because these things don't make sense. They don't add up.
Yeah. Cause I mean, again, I know not a good thing, but back in, early like 2000s, like everything was sort of set at 13 plus. And so again, thinking as a teacher, I know that when I moved into doing more professional development work, I even started to use that gut check. Like if I started to get concerned when I pulled something up, like what was that related content that might show up, or what was, like there was one app I was just in love with, and it was audio recording, and it was a really big button, and it was super easy to use. And then all of a sudden they started putting these like, maybe you want to listen to this in the bottom. And I'm like, no, I really don't. I just wanted one big button to push. That was easy. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of decisions we made in the early aughts. I think both in technology and for most of us in our personal lives that we don't want to keep making now. Yeah. So I would
I stopped doing that.
Yeah, I would put signing in multiple kids under a teacher account. Like that's one of those things that we just flat out need to stop doing. Yeah, that's bad practice. If you're doing that, you're getting yourself into a legally dubious area, and you're modeling bad practice for kids.
Yeah, and it was one of those things too, I think now about how like trying to model how do we respect everybody's community space. And I remember trying to justify it to myself, but I do realize where there were definite challenges.
Yeah.
But it works so well. No, it's nice to know that there's so many other options. Again, there weren't a lot of options back in the day. Although it's funny, I found myself getting super creative with productivity suites. So whether it was like, Office or, we were Apple iWork that we were using, and like just even the core Google Docs, like how do I use those things really, really well so that I'm not stepping into it when I get in other places?
Yeah.
Because you can get super creative and you have to just think about it in a different way. So, I mean, I guess to kind of, bring this conversation, sort of bringing things together, but if, again, trying to find that balance to say, we really want our teachers to be able to help students share their work, but we also want to make sure we're modeling these really good, these skills that they need to be able to take forward, through the rest of their lives, like to really be able to think about. You're really making me wonder if I ever signed anything about the fact that, those plagiarism checkers have every paper I've written for the last 2 years. But to be a critical consumer of it, but like, have you seen any just really great lessons or great approaches that teachers have used to try and help introduce this to kids or reinforce it?
I mean, for a lot of these things, there's a host of digital citizenship curriculum out there. I mean, Common Sense has a raft of digital citizenship materials, and those are solid. I mean, the place where I always recommend starting is actually just asking your kids what they want to share or if they want to share, and asking them if they do want to share, who do they want to share with, and actually having it all start from learner agency and student, because I think it's actually appropriate in some cases where a kid might not want to share. And if you have a kid who has, we don't need to get all that imaginative to think of a range of reasons why a student actually might not want to put their stuff out there. Like if there's a student who's been going through a nasty divorce, or if there's a DV situation in the home, like in some cases it actually is directly a safety issue. And the notion of actually sharing our work as a universal good, I think we need to deconstruct that a little bit and not just accept that. With those, making sure that we are actually respecting the agency and kind of obtaining informed consent from learners is a key starting point, and modeling that as the foundation for everything that comes afterwards is the way to start. With those things in place, most teachers are actually worried about compliance, and compliance is really the easiest thing to do. And you can be fully compliant with all applicable laws, but still kind of not respecting people's privacy. So the more we can actually ground these conversations in personal elements, like what do you want to share? Who do you want to share it with? Why do you want to share it? When do you want to share it? Do you ever want to retract it? Kind of just some of these basic human decisions that that we can make happen with tech. I think that's a good way to both model this type of thought in our classrooms, and to give students the tools they need to talk about into the future.
I'm always saying to teachers too, like you have to think about your school community and culture. Like what's the culture around your school? I made a huge mistake when I was first teaching where I was so excited to start sharing the kids' work digitally, and the parents really wanted something to come home in a backpack. It was too early. Like it was before the social media was crazy and before everything else. And like they really wanted something tangible. And I forgot about that huge value of a kid bringing something home that they could touch and stick on the refrigerator. And so, you know, there was this comment like, well, I don't know what the kids are doing. I'm thinking, well, it's all on the blog and you've got all this great stuff. And they're like, well, it doesn't come home.
Yeah. And you could just send them home with CDs.
I did that a couple of times. I can't tell you how many hours I spent making DVDs of the narrated folk tales for the 4th grade at one point. I'm fairly certain I almost spent the night at school, like burning the things. You could hear it cranking. 27 DVDs later of folk tales.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's interesting, you know, you mentioned the idea of a school community, you know, like reasonable knowledge of the school community, and that's actually language that's in FERPA too. But the thing is, like, what is the definition of a school community? And this is something that I first heard from Jim Siegel, who's he's at Fairfax County Public Schools, but he actually asked the question. It's the right question. You know, when somebody can spend half an hour Googling a school and its community and its neighborhood, what does a reasonable knowledge of the school community mean? Like our school communities are potentially the internet and anybody who knows how to search well. So I mean, I think that with that in mind, it kind of shifts what, you know, we don't really have a fixed and set notion of, like, a fixed and set definition of what any given school community could be.
Yeah, and again, the culture within that community. You know, we had issues too, where just like we talk to kids about privacy, how do we talk to parents about things like commenting? I've had some fantastic conversations with different people. I mean, my poor mom, like on my own, I had my blog set up for a while, and like she would get the email dispatch, and she didn't realize if she replied to that email that it would have showed up on the blog if I hadn't had the moderation turned on. So like I wrote this article and I was all proud of it, and I got back, oh, this is really nice, and when you come next week, what would you like for dinner? And like, just not knowing that that's where it could have gone. So I called mom back. Because mom's my one reader, pretty much. Too. But again, not knowing, you know, I've had situations where people have said, well, we had to turn the comments off because we hadn't had a chance to bring the community in terms of what were we looking for, and like what were the implications of it.
Well, I mean, and also, I mean, to get a sense of what community commenting can look like. I mean, if people are unfamiliar with that, just, you know, go to a sporting event and listen to people shouting at the refs. Like that's your comment section.
Yeah, and a lot of those things are, I lost my train of thought. Commenting, turned on, parent. Oh, this one I learned, I had an issue where I was brought into the head of school's office of why was the student's work on Facebook? And I'm like, I don't know, I didn't put it on Facebook. And it turned out I'd created a set of an album of videos in Vimeo and password protected it for the parents. And so a parent had shared the link with the password.
Ah, there you go. Yeah.
It's defeated the purpose on that one. So again, understand culture, community. It's, you know, it's one of those, I guess it takes a village. Like, how are we really going to protect our kids? And I know we've spent a lot of time talking about at the school and the district level, but I think there's also that parent piece we may have to talk about again later.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, one of my personal favorites is the parent who's concerned about, you know, the school district sharing X, but then they have on their Facebook or their Instagram account, like, pictures going back years of the kid doing, like, literally everything. And it's like, well, you know, I mean, I think sometimes there's a differential standard applied. You know, and arguably there's something, you know, the parental consent issue is there and it's real, but at the same time, the privacy of the person, of the subject, is often not considered in some of these things.
Yeah, there've been some great articles lately too. Like, at what age do you start asking your child, like, would you like this shared? Do you want me to put this out?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, do you actually not share anything until they can consent? Yeah. You know, I mean, I think that's, like, I don't think many people think about it like that, but it's not a bad way to go either. Like, until you can actually get affirmative consent, is it, you know, do you have a right to share? Do you have a right to put it out there?
Yeah. And again, I think about the sandbox approach too with kids. Like, how do we create this really safe environment where we're just sharing within our class, or we're just sharing in this spot, so that, again, the oopsie factor.
Yep. Yeah, no, it's yeah, we all we all need to make mistakes. And
Right.
yeah, I mean, and you know, I think a lot of us now, like, we tend to forget what our life would look like if even just one of our big mistakes was online. I mean, I think, you know, I can think of multiple cringeworthy events between 15 and 25 in my life that are thankfully forgotten. I mean, I think most of us can.
Right. There's some negatives that I am really happy were like cut with a pair of scissors one time. Like, so same idea that I think we can all agree to. And then help the kid. I mean, but you know, our kids are in a totally different space where they can't just cut the negatives up and make it go away.
Yeah. Yeah.
To date both of us on that one.
I'm all that comfortable with that.
I'm okay with it too. We had a running joke amongst some classmates. We were talking about CDs, and a younger classmate goes, "CD, what's that?" And I'm like, "Well, it's like a small record." Oh, wait, you don't know that. It's okay. Yep. So, all right. Well, Bill, thank you so much for joining today and for chatting about all of this. I know I always really value all of your input anytime I have questions. I feel like I'm your annoying Twitter friend. It's like, Bill, what about this?
No. Always ask. Like, I often will have no idea, but definitely feel like ask anytime.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I think hopefully this will be super helpful for people as they're trying to navigate all of these different ideas back and forth. And, you know, we can find this really great balance between giving our kids, you know, the avenue and the voice that they need, and then making sure they're safe when they're doing it. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me on. Thanks.
All right. Great. Thanks.
Yeah. Have a good day.